They said London had seen horrors before, but never like this. The morning fog clung to the bridge, heavy and sour, as the city gathered to witness a nightmare dressed as justice. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't even punishment. It was theatre, England's grandest performance of fear. And at its centre lay a man once called the Guardian of Scotland, stripped of armour, of name and soon of flesh. William Wallace was no stranger to death. He'd sent thousands to meet it. But on that August morning in 1305, he would discover that England had mastered something darker, the art of destroying, not just a man but an idea. The crowd pressed closer, necks craning, whispers hissing like snakes. They had heard stories of him, the giant from the north, the savage who burned abbeys and butchered priests. Yet as they waited for his arrival, the truth was simpler. They had come to be entertained. When the gates opened, the noise rolled like thunder. A cage made of iron appeared, pulled by horses, the figure within bruised, filthy, and silent. The hero who once made English soldiers flee at Stirling now hung in chains, staring through the bars with an expression no one could name. What thoughts lived behind those eyes? Did he still believe his cause mattered? Did he still believe Scotland would rise again? The journey south had been endless, a slow parade of humiliation. Through every town he passed, Wallace was paraded like a beast. Men spat, women cursed, children threw stones and laughed as if it were a festival. But inside that cage, Wallace did not cry out. He knew what awaited him in London, and the imagination is often crueler than the blade. Edward the Freens, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, wanted more than revenge. He wanted erasure. And for that Wallace had to die not once but many times. By the time the cage reached the city, the smell of rot and filth filled the air. London was swollen with heat, buzzing with anticipation. The trial was already prepared, the verdict written before the man had even arrived. But first, the people had to see him, had to watch the mighty warrior broken and dragged through their streets. Wallace spent his last night in the home of a London official. No record tells what he said. Some claim he prayed. Others said he remained silent. But silence can speak louder than screams. When dawn came, he was led out not as a prisoner but as a trophy. Knights surrounded him, banners fluttering above the jeering crowd. The streets swarmed with faces, all eager to witness the fall of the rebel they'd been taught to hate. The procession moved toward Westminster Hall, that vast wooden cathedral of English power. Inside, nobles and clerks filled every corner, sweat gleaming on faces as they jostled for a better view. This wasn't justice, it was a spectacle with a single purpose: to show that no one, not even the saviour of Scotland, could defy the crown. As Wallace was brought forward, someone placed a wreath upon his head, a crown of mockery. The crowd roared with laughter. It was said he had once claimed kingship. Now they gave him one made of thorns. The gesture burned hotter than fire. Then came the charges: treason, murder, arson, rebellion, and crimes against God himself. The list was long enough to fill a scroll. But even as the accusations poured out, one fact glared through the noise. William Wallace had never sworn loyalty to England. In law, he could not be a traitor. When they finally asked for his reply, he raised his head and spoke with a calm that froze the hall. He said he could not betray a king he had never served. Those who heard it remembered the words for the rest of their lives. They were not loud, not shouted, but sharp enough to cut through time. For a moment, silence reigned. And then, as if ashamed of that flicker of admiration, the judges declared his words meaningless. Wallace was already condemned. No argument could change it. The sentence was written in cold precision. He would be dragged through London, hanged until near death, then cut open alive, his heart and entrails burned before his eyes. His body would be chopped into quarters, his head displayed on the bridge as warning. A punishment not just to kill, but to unmake. That evening, as the crowds dispersed, London hummed with excitement. Children repeated what they'd heard. Merchants wagered how long the Scotsman would last. And in a small guarded room, Wallace, bound, beaten yet unbroken, closed his eyes to rest before facing hell itself. But rest did not come. In the dark, the sounds of the city seeped through. The clatter of carts, the drunken laughter of taverns, the the whispered prayers of the pious. Somewhere beyond the walls, the scaffold waited. Was he afraid? Perhaps. But fear was useless now. He had fought too long, lost too much to tremble before men. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and exhaustion, there remained a single spark, the knowledge that if he could endure even for a moment longer than they expected, his defiance might outlive his body, and that spark would soon set the world on fire. The morning broke with cruel clarity. Sunlight cut through the mist like a blade, glinting off the metal of chains as William Wallace was brought out into the street. No trumpets, no prayers, just the low rumble of horses waiting to drag him to his death. The sentence had begun. They stripped him naked before fastening his body to a wooden frame called a hurdle, a crude plank dragged by horses through every filth-soaked corner of the city. The idea wasn't speed, it was spectacle. The wooden slats groaned as ropes tightened around his wrists and ankles, forcing his chest down until his ribs pressed against the timber. The crowd surged forward, eager for movement, and when the horses lurched ahead, a cheer erupted that could be heard all the way to Westminster. Every inch of London's stone streets became part of the punishment. The first jolts tore skin from his shoulders. The cobblestones, slick with mud and refuse, shredded flesh until the wood beneath him ran slick with blood. The people threw anything they could grab. Rotten fruit, stones, curses shouted between mouthfuls of ale. Wallace did not respond. His lips moved, but only the horses heard what he said. Was it prayer? Or was he simply counting the seconds until it ended? The procession twisted through the busiest districts, taking the longest possible route to Smithfield. Edward had designed it so that no Londoner could claim ignorance of what happened to rebels. Shopkeepers leaned from windows. Children climbed barrels to see. Each jolt carved another red line down the street. The smell of iron and sweat followed like a ghost. And yet somehow Wallace endured. The chroniclers said he kept his eyes open the entire time. When the crowd shouted "traitor," he turned his head and looked at them, just looked, until the jeers faltered into an uneasy silence. Pain could break a man's body, but shame could silence a mob. By the time they reached Smithfield, his skin had been stripped in patches, bone showing white through torn muscle. The blood trail behind him was thick enough to track for miles. Even hardened soldiers looked away. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Smithfield was the stage prepared for England's grandest display of cruelty. Merchants sold bread and ale, mothers hoisted their children high to teach them loyalty, and nobles took seats on wooden stands built for the occasion. Beneath the banner of the Red Cross, the scaffold rose like an altar. They lifted Wallace onto the platform. He left a streak of blood behind him. The executioner, face hidden beneath a hood blackened by years of work, tested the rope and nodded. There would be no mercy in his hands. The noose went around Wallace's neck. Rough hemp scratched at torn flesh. Two assistants pulled the rope taut, lifting him just enough that his feet barely cleared the boards. It was a deliberate cruelty, death held at arm's length. His body jerked violently as the air vanished from his lungs. The sound was not a scream but a strangled rasp, a rhythm of choking breath that merged with the creak of the beam. His legs kicked once, twice, then again. The crowd, eager for drama, shouted louder. They were watching a man being unmade, one heartbeat at a time. After what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed, the executioner gave a signal. The rope slackened and Wallace dropped to the scaffold like a sack of broken glass. His chest convulsed, dragging in breath with a wheeze that sounded more like drowning than life. He was still alive, and the real performance had only just begun. The assistants hauled his limp form onto a wooden table, spreading his limbs wide. Iron shackles clamped his wrists and ankles, the metal sizzling against blood-wet skin. They strapped his head so that he couldn't look away. Around the platform, the noise faded to a hush. Even the cruelest among them knew the next act would test their stomachs. The executioner approached with a knife as thin and sharp as a whisper. The first cut was small, just above the groin, but the crowd gasped as blood spilled dark and heavy across his thighs. Then came another slice, longer this time, deliberate and slow. The smell of opened flesh rolled over the square. Someone retched. The emasculation was methodical. Piece by piece, the executioner worked like a craftsman, not a butcher. Each movement practiced, careful not to end the show too soon. He lifted what he'd taken, held it for the crowd, then tossed it into the brazier beside him. Fire hissed, smoke rose, and the scent of burning meat mixed with the cheers of those who hadn't yet turned away. Wallace screamed then, not words, just sound torn from somewhere deeper than lungs. His body shook, but the shackles held. When the knife returned, it traveled upward. A long incision split his abdomen from chest to pelvis. Steam rose from the wound, white against the summer air. The executioner reached inside. The crowd leaned closer, morbid curiosity outweighing pity. One by one, he drew out Wallace's intestines, stretching them like rope before casting them into the flames. Each time the fire hissed, Wallace gasped, his breath a wet rattle that would not end. It was said that the human mind can detach from unbearable pain, that it floats somewhere above the body, watching from a distance. If that was true, perhaps Wallace was already gone, hovering above the crowd as they devoured the sight of his suffering. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. His body still moved, twitching like a dying flame. The executioner's arms shone red to the elbows, his blade glinting with each motion. Finally, when Wallace's breaths became shallow whispers, the hooded man reached for the axe. The first swing struck deep but failed to sever. A gasp swept through the crowd. The second blow did the work. The sound was dull, heavy, final. The head rose into the air, gripped by matted hair. Blood dripped down the handle onto the boards. "Behold the head of a traitor!" the executioner shouted, voice echoing across Smithfield. But among the spectators, something changed. The cheers faltered. Men turned pale. Mothers pulled their children close, because the man who had refused to kneel had met death without begging. And that kind of defiance cannot be burned, buried, or forgotten. The scaffold reeked of smoke, iron, and fear. What remained of William Wallace's body slumped forward, a heap of muscle and blood, too mangled to resemble the warrior who once led Scotland's armies. But for the English crown, the job was not yet finished. Death was only the beginning. The executioner wiped his axe on a rag already soaked through, then nodded to his assistants. They knew what came next. The quartering. The word alone could drain color from even the bravest faces. Wallace's limbs were laid out on a heavy block, his ruined torso positioned for the final dissection of justice. One blow, then another. The sound wasn't sharp, it was wet, like cleaving meat in a butcher's stall. First came the arms, hacked from the shoulders, then the legs struck away at the hips. Each swing was deliberate, almost reverent, as if they were carving a message into history itself. The crowd that had cheered minutes before now stood silent. Even cruelty has limits, and they were watching those limits snap one by one. When it was done, 4/4 of what had once been a man lay separated on the wood. The executioner stepped back, breathing hard, his mask slick with sweat beneath the hood. What had begun as punishment had become ritual, each cut a sentence, each bucket of blood another paragraph in the story of power. Her clerk took notes, carefully listing every stage of the act, every object used, every word spoken. The Crown wanted this recorded in perfect detail. Edward Longshanks believed terror only worked if it could be repeated. Wallace's destruction would serve as the manual. But not every observer felt triumph. Somewhere in the crowd, a soldier lowered his weapon and whispered to himself, "He didn't scream when the axe fell." It was true. Wallace had faced the end in silence, and that silence would echo louder than any curse. Once the butchery was complete, the executioner performed the final grotesque courtesy. Wallace's head was placed in boiling water mixed with herbs to slow decay. The flesh turned pale, waxen. When it was tarred and mounted on a pike, the features remained unmistakable. The broad forehead, the strong jaw, the defiant line of the mouth. That head would soon watch over London Bridge like a guardian twisted into a warning. Each quarter of his body was salted and sealed into wooden barrels. Couriers stood ready to carry them north. One would hang above the gate of Newcastle, another at Berwick, another at Stirling, and the last, depending on which chronicler you believe, either Perth or Aberdeen. Edward wanted the message clear. Rebellion ended not only in death, but in dismemberment of the very idea of freedom. But the message didn't land as he intended. When the carts rolled into Scotland bearing Wallace's remains, they didn't inspire obedience. They inspired grief, then rage. People came to see the grim trophies, not to shudder, but to remember. They whispered prayers under their breath. They left flowers where guards weren't watching. In darkness, some touched the wooden stakes that held their heroes' flesh and swore vengeance. The English soldiers noticed. They wrote reports complaining that crowds gathered nightly, that songs were being sung about the dead man, that even children spoke his name like a prayer. Edward's masterpiece of intimidation was already unraveling. Back in London, Longshanks sat satisfied, convinced he had erased a legend. But history was already shifting under his feet. Wallace's execution wasn't silencing the Scots, it was binding them together. His body might have been divided into 4, but his memory multiplied in thousands. The irony is almost cruel. Edward wanted obedience, but he created devotion. He wanted to erase a name, but ensured it would never die. Months later, across the Highlands, stories of Wallace's courage spread like wildfire. Bards sang not of his death, but of his endurance. They told of how he never cried out, how his final breath was a prayer for freedom, how the fire that consumed his body failed to burn his spirit. In taverns and churches, people whispered that no man could suffer so much without divine strength. Some began to call him a martyr. Others went further, calling him Scotland's chosen son, punished by tyrants but blessed by heaven. The line between man and myth blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. And somewhere in that transformation, another man was listening. Robert the Bruce, a noble who had once sided with England, found himself haunted by the image of Wallace's death. The story of how Wallace faced the executioner without flinching spread through the Scottish courts. A legend Bruce could neither forget nor ignore. What kind of ruler could he be if he lived safely under the crown that had murdered his country's greatest defender? Within a year, he would raise the Scottish standard again, this time not in Wallace's shadow, but because of it. When men asked him why, his answer was simple: better to die like Wallace than live like Edward's servant. The execution meant to break Scotland had instead birthed its rebirth. Every soldier who picked up a sword in the years to come carried part of Wallace's story inside them. And for the English who thought terror could hold a nation, the proof of their failure hung in the mountains and the glens, in every whispered vow of freedom that echoed his name. Even centuries later, when the wars were long over and kings had turned to dust, the memory of that day in Smithfield lingered. It wasn't the sight of his suffering that survived, it was the look in his eyes, the quiet defiance of a man who refused to kneel even when the world tried to cut him apart. That is what tyrants never understand. A body can be destroyed, but an idea cannot. And in trying to erase William Wallace, England had carved his name into eternity. But this legend had only just begun to change shape. Over the next 100 years, chroniclers and poets would rewrite his story again and again, turning his agony into scripture, his death into destiny. What began as horror would soon become something sacred, a memory no sword could kill. In the years that followed, the story of Wallace's final hours refused to die. It crept through Scotland like smoke, thin, unstoppable, clinging to everything it touched. The English thought they'd silenced a rebellion, but all they had done was give the people a new symbol to believe in. At first it was whispers, a farmer telling his sons about the man who'd stood unbroken before a king, a merchant humming a tune on the road, a tune that spoke of courage whispered between verses. But whispers became songs, and songs became stories, and soon Scotland was singing his name louder than any sermon. The English crown tried to crush the legend. Orders were sent to punish anyone caught reciting verses about Wallace. Musicians were jailed, their instruments destroyed. Priests were warned that even speaking his name from the pulpit would be considered treason. But every act of censorship only sharpened the myth. A forbidden story always spreads faster. In taverns, bards began to change the details. Wallace didn't just face his killers, he forgave them. He didn't merely endure torture, he sang psalms as his flesh burned. The horror of his death became a tale of divine strength, a man so pure in purpose that pain itself could not conquer him. History blurred into faith. Some said his final words were a prayer. Others claimed they were a curse upon tyrants. No one knew for certain, but the lack of certainty was what made it powerful. Every Scot could imagine the ending that moved them most, and each version became true in its own way. Meanwhile, the English chroniclers, desperate to reclaim the narrative, wrote of Wallace as a criminal, a savage who got what he deserved. They detailed his crimes with precision: burned abbeys, slain priests, plundered towns, trying to paint him as a beast, not a man. But even in their accounts, fragments of awe slipped through. They described his courage at trial, his calm before death, his refusal to kneel. They couldn't help themselves. Even enemies sometimes recognize greatness when they see it. The contradiction grew impossible to ignore. How could a monster die with such dignity? How could a villain inspire so many to risk their lives in his name? In trying to destroy his reputation, England had only confirmed his immortality. Generations later, a monk named Walter Bower would write that Wallace met his fate with the strength of the saints. He described how, in the final moments, the Scotsman looked upward as if already beyond pain, already halfway to heaven. It might not have been literal truth, but in a world hungry for heroes, it was the truth people needed. By then, Robert the Bruce had fulfilled the dream Wallace died for. Scotland had broken free at last. Its independence wrested from the same empire that once tore its champion apart. At the victory of Bannockburn, many soldiers carried charms carved with Wallace's initials. To them, he was no ghost. He was a guardian. Even English soldiers, those who'd once mocked his name, found themselves haunted by what they'd witnessed or heard. In the barracks and taverns of London, stories spread among the ranks about how Wallace never begged, never cursed, how he died like a king though he wore no crown. Some men swore that on foggy nights near Smithfield, they could still hear faint echoes of his last breath, carried on the wind, a whisper that chilled even the loyal. Years became decades, and the legend deepened roots. Poets began to rewrite the tale, layering new meaning over old blood. They spoke of Wallace not as a soldier, but as an idea, the soul of a people refusing to yield. His broken body was reimagined as the seed from which a nation's freedom grew. And freedom once planted cannot be uprooted. For the Church, his death became a moral parable. Priests who once condemned rebellion now spoke of the martyred knight who resisted oppression. They compared his suffering to Christ's passion, the betrayal, the trial, the agony, the sacrifice. To pray for Scotland became to pray through Wallace. The English governors despised it. Reports from occupied towns described people kneeling before the posts where his body parts had once hung. Flowers appeared overnight, ribbons tied to the stakes. Even when the guards tore them down, new ones replaced them by dawn. The dead man was performing miracles of unity that no living general had achieved. And what could they do? Remove the displays and they admitted defeat. Leave them standing and they fed the fire. In the end, practicality won. The remains quietly vanished, supposedly buried in secret. But rumors persisted, rumors that loyal Scots had stolen the pieces, buried them on sacred ground where no English boot would ever tread. The people clung to those rumors because they meant something profound, that Wallace was home again. King Edward I, the architect of the execution, lived only 2 more years. On his deathbed, he ordered his bones to march with his armies until Scotland was crushed. Yet even his corpse couldn't finish what Wallace had begun. His son, Edward II, inherited the crown but not the will. The war that had started with one man's defiance would end with an entire nation refusing to kneel. And so the execution designed to end a rebellion had instead birthed a legend that not even kings could kill. Wallace's courage became a mirror that forced every generation to ask itself the same question: what is freedom worth? Maybe that's why his story never faded, because every era finds its tyrants, every age breeds its rebels, and every heart that hears of Wallace feels the echo of his choice, the terrible, magnificent choice to die for a principle greater than oneself. History moved on, but his defiance remained. Even centuries later, when his name appeared in poetry, in theatre, in the whispers of dreamers and revolutionaries, it carried the same electric pulse. A single man, standing alone before the might of an empire and saying no. No crown can survive that kind of truth for long. Time has a way of softening most legends, sanding down the edges until heroes become statues and pain turns poetic. But the tale of William Wallace resisted that. The longer it lived, the sharper it grew. Each century added a new layer of meaning, and yet at its heart remained the same image: a man standing defiant against a throne that demanded obedience. As the medieval age faded, his story passed into new mouths. The poets of the 15th century sang of Wallace with the reverence once reserved for saints. One of them, a blind minstrel known as Blind Harry, wrote verses that would echo through Scotland for generations. In his hands, the rebel became larger than life, a warrior chosen by destiny, fighting not just for land, but for the very soul of freedom. It wasn't history, it was something deeper. Harry's words painted scenes of courage and betrayal, of faith against cruelty, of a man so unyielding that even the devil feared his spirit. And though much of it was imagined, the emotion was real. People who could not read memorized those verses, passing them down like scripture. Parents recited them to children as both bedtime stories and warnings. Never let tyranny rule your heart. In time, the English chronicler's version of Wallace, the outlaw, the murderer, the savage, was buried beneath this flood of reverence. The victor's narrative dissolved, replaced by something far more powerful: myth shaped by pain. The people who had once been subjects were now storytellers, and their version of truth was the one that endured. But what made his legend so persistent wasn't merely hatred of England or pride in rebellion. It was the universality of what he represented. Wallace had become the embodiment of resistance itself, the proof that even one voice could defy an empire. That notion struck fear into kings and hope into commoners, and the more those in power tried to suppress it, the louder it echoed. During the Reformation, when Scotland's soul once again divided, reformers saw in Wallace the figure of spiritual defiance. They compared his struggle to their own fight against corruption, calling him the man who died not just for freedom of land, but for freedom of conscience. For them, the chains that bound him were the same chains that bound faith. Centuries later, in the Enlightenment, philosophers reimagined him as a rational hero, proof that the desire for liberty was part of the human condition. Thinkers and writers across Europe invoked his name when discussing the right to govern oneself. In dusty lecture halls and candlelit drawing rooms, his defiance became an argument for democracy before the word even existed. Then came the Romantics, who turned his suffering into beauty. Pain, they said, was the crucible of purity. Wallace's torment became an example of noble endurance, of the soul transcending the body. Paintings, poems, even plays portrayed him as a man who achieved a kind of divine immortality through agony. In an age obsessed with feeling, his death became the perfect symbol: horror made holy. And yet beneath every retelling, one fact remained undeniable: his death had been real. No amount of poetry could erase the cruelty that birthed the legend. Historians in later centuries returned to the records, reading the official documents that detailed every coin spent on the execution, every step of the ceremony. They found the chilling precision of bureaucracy: payments to guards, wood for the scaffold, salt for the body parts. It was all written down, as if horror needed receipts. Those records, meant to legitimize the act, did the opposite. They exposed it. They turned propaganda into evidence, proof of a system so sure of its righteousness that it documented its own barbarity. Modern scholars would later study the psychology of those public deaths, seeing in them the anatomy of control. Executions like Wallace's weren't simply punishments, they were messages carved into flesh, reminders that the crown ruled not only by law, but by terror. Yet terror has a flaw. It burns hot, but never lasts. Fear fades, while defiance lingers. That's the paradox the English never understood. The more they displayed his body, the more they displayed their own cruelty. The more they tried to erase him, the deeper he engraved himself into their memory. A man can be killed only once, but his idea can die 1,000 times and still rise again. When future generations walked across London Bridge and saw the rows of heads blackened by sun and time, they may not have recognized them all, but one name always lingered, the one who stared longest, whose gaze seemed still alive beneath tar and rot: William Wallace. Some travelers claimed that the wind around the bridge seemed colder, that gulls wouldn't perch near that particular pike. Superstition, perhaps, or maybe the human mind simply refuses to forget the face of injustice, no matter how many centuries pass. In Scotland, meanwhile, the legend became a mirror for every struggle that followed. Farmers resisting landlords, workers demanding rights, soldiers dying on foreign soil. All invoked Wallace's name as proof that defiance was a duty. Even when centuries blurred the details of his life, the essence remained: never surrender to those who believe might equals right. What had begun as a sentence of death had transformed into a statement of life. Wallace's body may have been torn into 4, but his story bound a nation together in one heartbeat. As one old Scottish saying went, "The English took his limbs, but he took their fear." Across generations, that sentiment held power. Every rebellion, every movement, every act of courage that followed seemed to carry a trace of him. His suffering had become a blueprint for resilience. And in that blueprint lay a truth that every ruler should have feared: you can destroy a man, but you can't control what he becomes after. The bridge where his head once stood eventually fell, rebuilt again and again, the stones changing with each century. But the story outlived every bridge, every crown, every empire that rose and fell in its shadow. Because William Wallace was no longer just a man or even a martyr. He was the idea that freedom is worth any pain, that dignity can survive even in dismemberment, and that courage can echo louder than the sound of an empire's drums. And in that echo, a question still lives: if faced with the same choice, would we have the strength to stand as he did? Centuries have passed since the day Wallace's head was lifted over London Bridge, yet the echo of that moment still travels through time. The stones that once drank his blood have long been replaced, but the story refuses to fade. It lingers because it was never really about one man. It was about the line between obedience and freedom, and what it costs to cross it. When scholars reopened the ancient court rolls, they found evidence of deliberate choreography. Every step of the execution was planned with political precision. The ropes, the knives, the order of mutilation, all calculated not just to punish Wallace, but to teach the world a lesson about power. But history doesn't always obey its masters. Those same records that were meant to glorify the crown became its confession. The documents described payments for carts, for wood, for the boiling of his head, for the transport of the quarters. Bureaucratic handwriting spelling out brutality. The clerks who signed their names to those lines likely thought they were recording justice. Instead, they left behind a map of how fear operates when it wears the mask of law. Later generations would study those pages and feel the chill of recognition. Because the methods didn't die with Wallace. They were adapted, refined, exported. The idea that rebellion was treason to be broken publicly would echo through centuries, from Wales to Ireland and far beyond the shores of Britain itself. The punishment that ended Wallace's life became a blueprint for empires. Destroy not just the body of the rebel, but the hope they represent. And yet, even as those in power repeated the ritual of suppression, the pattern never worked for long, because there will always be people who remember the moment when one man refused to kneel. When the Enlightenment dawned, Wallace's words at trial were quoted by philosophers as the earliest cry for self-determination. He could not betray a king he never served, a simple argument that would become the seed of entire revolutions. From colonial uprisings to modern independence movements, that defiance found new voices in new languages. His ghost walked with every people who ever looked at an oppressor and said, "You have no right to rule me." By the 19th century, Scotland had turned his legend into monument and memory. His story was carved into stone towers, painted onto canvases, recited in classrooms. The man who once hung naked and broken before a jeering crowd now stood cast in bronze against the sky. Tourists came to stare at the statue, but the Scots came to remember. His eyes were forever set north, as if still watching over the land he refused to surrender. Writers romanticized him, politicians quoted him, and schoolchildren learned his name before they could name their own kings. But beneath all the ceremony, the raw truth remained. Freedom is never given, only taken, and every generation must decide what it's willing to pay for it. Modern historians, with their microscopes and moral distance, often ask whether Wallace was truly a hero or merely a man of violence shaped by violent times. But that question misses the point. Heroism isn't purity, it's endurance. And Wallace endured more than any man should, not for conquest, but for the simple belief that a nation should own itself. The science of pain now tells us things medieval chroniclers couldn't. We know the human body can remain conscious for minutes after such mutilation. We know that the brain, overwhelmed by agony, can slip into a strange clarity where fear and courage coexist. Wallace's mind in those final minutes may have hovered between worlds, half in the fire, half in eternity. What we do know is that even his enemies wrote of his composure. They recorded it unwillingly, but they recorded it nonetheless. The silence before the axe, the refusal to beg. They saw a man who, stripped of everything, still would not surrender the one thing they could never take, his will. That is why his execution outlived his conquerors. Edward I, who orchestrated the spectacle, died 2 years later, still fighting a war he could not win. His empire of fear crumbled before his bones were cold. His son, weak and indecisive, would lose Scotland entirely. The man he thought he had erased became the spirit that haunted his throne. In time, Wallace's legend would grow beyond borders, inspiring not just Scots but all who recognized the shape of tyranny. Freedom movements across continents invoked his name, seeing in him the eternal struggle between authority and dignity. His story became proof that cruelty can dominate flesh but never conscience. When people gather today in Stirling, near the monument that bears his sword, they look out over the same hills he once defended. The wind that brushes their faces carries the same scent of heather and rain that he knew. And somewhere in that silence between gusts, it's easy to imagine his voice, a whisper, not of revenge but of endurance. Empires fall, flags change, names fade, but courage survives. That's the quiet truth hidden in his death, the secret the executioners never understood. You cannot frighten people into forgetting what freedom feels like. You can only remind them how precious it is. So his story endures not because it is gruesome, but because it is human. Because even now, when the world seems ruled by those who mistake power for wisdom, there is still that same question echoing from 1305. What would you endure for your freedom? And perhaps that's the real punishment Edward I inflicted on his own legacy. For every man who learns what was done to Wallace, another begins to question the justice of the world that demanded it. William Wallace's body was reduced to ashes and memory, but his spirit, unyielding, furious, proud, still walks the earth. It walks wherever someone refuses to kneel, wherever a voice speaks truth to power, wherever pain is borne for the sake of dignity. And that is why more than 700 years later, his execution remains one of history's darkest lessons, and one of humanity's brightest beacons. Because sometimes martyrdom isn't the end of the story, it's the moment the story becomes immortal. So when you hear his name, remember not the torture, not the terror, but the choice, the unbreakable will that turned agony into legend. And if this story stirred you, if it reminded you that courage still matters in a fearful world, then give it a voice. Like this video, share his story, and keep the spirit of William Wallace alive here on Sleepy Owl. Because legends don't fade, they wait to be remembered.